I'm Aromar Revi. I'm the director of IHS. I've also been, over the last many years, involved both with development processes in the country and also trying to sort of work through this frame that we're trying to deal with. I guess the important thing to say, I get quite directly, is we're sitting at a pivotal time at the current moment, not only as far as India is concerned, but also as far as the world is concerned. And that is because globally, at least, we are probably at a point of both economic and social crisis that we haven't seen since the Second World War. This is the 75th year of the United Nations, but we're still, as of yesterday, not able to put together a resolution that reflects that. As far as India is concerned, this is probably the most serious perfect storm that we've seen, both economically. We were in an economic downturn before the COVID crisis hit. We're going to have negative growth this year, and we have a unemployment situation and a livelihood situation that we've never seen before. So effectively, on the social front, on the economic front, we are seeing, a crisis that's probably worse than what we saw in 1971 when the Bangladesh crisis exploded, and probably in some dimensions almost as severe what we saw in the 1947-48 period. So I guess in that context, the core question is, is this sustainable development and goals something that is a nice thing to deal with, something that has got no relevance to the current context? And they're obviously something that we could really question ourselves about. Is this, and then many people in effect do that, because as far as people working on the ground are concerned, in cities where we're dealing with this crisis, in rural areas, in districts, and in fact in many states, most of them haven't heard of the SDGs. The SDGs are something that the nation states have agreed. India is a critical signatory to the process, but it's something that in some ways has yet to capture both the imagination and the process. So in that context, a lot of people would say that this is something that would be useful and interesting for a small set of people to talk about. But I think I'm going to try and present to you a case of why that may not necessarily be so. And I guess the first thing is, India's had a very long tryst with this process, and this tryst is almost 50 years long in some senses. One of the framing arguments of the Conference on Human Development in 1972, which sort of led to the framing of sustainable development somewhat later, was India's contribution, which basically said that poverty is the greatest polluter. That was the first time in some senses that the development and the environmental agendas came together. There were a whole range of international processes that we were part of, including the framing of the idea of sustainable development in the Brundtland Commission report. I had a peripheral role there in writing one of the background papers all the way back in '86, and then a range of other processes that led on to UNCED and the development of Agenda 21 in Rio in 1992, where in the post-Cold War era, there was an attempt to try and bring together or reconcile the challenges of development. If you remember at that point of time, there was a great deal of debate in India around large programs which have now come to fruition, including the Sardar Sarovar Dam and a whole range of other questions. So the idea was to try and bring these processes together and try and reconcile them in some ways. That led in the 2000s to the Millennium Development Goals, of which India was, I guess, an important part. But Millennium Development Goals in some ways were effectively sort of reached in many dimensions, primarily because China did a remarkable job over the 90s and the 2000s of bringing hundreds of millions of people out of poverty, now becoming the second or the largest economic sort of entity in the world. And then, there was an interregnum after that. We had Rio +20, and a number of countries, especially from Latin America, Africa, and Asia, especially after the 2008 crisis, called for a new framework which would bring together all of development, not only for developing countries, which is what the MDGs were. The MDGs, in effect, were about poor people in poor countries. But this was a larger frame because we recognized the world was in deep crisis, especially after the economic crisis of 2008. The opportunities of change that happened in Africa, especially in the Arab world with the so-called Arab Spring. And that led to an intense process of negotiations that the United Nations have not seen before. We spent about 2.5 years actually in the negotiations. I was, centrally involved in some of the process that's there. But in India, we find a significant shift that takes place at that point of time. From 92 till about 2014, the Indian development framework from the government of India downwards was defined by the planning process. Many of us have been part of that. I was from the 7th plan midterm review almost to the 12th plan, was actively involved in that. But we now have a framework which does not have planning, which does not actually connect the dots, while other countries like South Africa have established their planning commissions to deal with a whole range of things. So 2015 brought us 2 or 3 very interesting global processes. I would sort of almost imagine that in the current day and time, it may have been impossible to develop the global solidarity of all the countries in the world to actually put this agenda together. The 2030 development agenda, which I'll speak about in a second, the financing for development, which is somewhat weak in some ways because it really didn't bring all the resources together able to finance this, and the Paris Climate Agreement, which on the climate side, something that we'll be looking at rather carefully in this program, was something that in a sense has changed the paradigm in terms of relationship between environment and development. So in 2015, we got the SDGs. India was a very important part of that process. I was at the General Assembly at that point of time. There were some commitments that were made, but we also got this contradiction at the end of this year, again, something that we were part of actually dealing with the global environment. And, climate change is only one of 4 or 5 critical global environmental crises, including loss of biodiversity, questions of desertification, of deforestation, and the collapse of the oceans in some senses. And one of the challenges is, how does one bring together an education and epistemic frame that embraces this, not only at the macro level, because these 193 countries can agree on something, but in practice, it is the mobilization and the organization of citizens, of communities, of local government, of regional governments and other processes, and of course, the enterprise sector that will really make the transitions that we're talking about in the kind of time in which these need to be executed. I mean, the important thing about the SDGs are they are target driven to a particular date. There was a political consensus that we had to achieve the end of poverty, dealing with universal coverage of healthcare, ending hunger, and dealing with universal coverage of education by 2030. And that's not only, as you'll see in a second, for so-called developing or least developed countries or poor regions, even in middle-income countries like India, but it was for the whole world. So this was a big shift in some senses. It primarily comes from the orientation that we do have the resources globally. There's enough wealth, there is enough technology, there are enough resources for us to do it. The question is, how do we actually mobilize the institutional capacity, the epistemic framing, to deal with the severe asymmetries and injustices that we face across the world in trying to address this question. So essentially, the SDGs, for those of us who don't know it or don't know it very well, is a universal development agenda. It's basically reaching out to all people everywhere. There's 17 goals. They're actually quite messy. When we started the design and the discussion on this in 2012, 13, the idea was that you should have 10 goals. And then the reason was very simple. Every young girl child has 10 fingers, and you should be able to count off the goals on each finger of the hand. And if you're able to do that, that becomes the basis on which we're able to transform our view of the world and the way that we put things together. So it's a fairly simple framework as it's currently laid out. It was a very intense negotiation. It took almost 3 years to make that happen. And I think that's what makes a difference from some things in the past. It has many faults, including the fact that it's quite complex to deal with. It has 169 targets, very difficult to understand, even for the development practitioner or the sophisticated academic. Forget about, bringing it into the classroom. But the reason is very real, and that was, it was an intense negotiation across completely different worldviews in terms of development, in terms of which part of the world you came from, what kind of governance frame did you deal with. So it's simple, you can see it up there. The core set of SDGs, what dealing with questions that we've dealt with for 150 years. You can go back to Engels and Marx and you can find them at the end of poverty, the end of hunger, dealing with questions of universal healthcare, the real crisis we're seeing just now, and education. And then there were things that came to us from the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, almost the start of the United Nations, dealing with inequality, dealing with peace and justice and partnership, and a new set of goals which have emerged, I would say, in the last maybe 2 or 3 decades. Usually environmental goals, dealing with environmental questions, climate action, which is kind of very new, and of course the one that we were very centrally involved in. IHS was critically involved in helping frame and negotiate SDG 11 on sustainable cities and communities. So it's a system that comes together. But inside this system, which seems nice and in some senses pretty, but messy and complicated, there are some fairly radical ideas, which now when countries and member states look back at it, they wonder why they've actually agreed to. And I think one of the most interesting ideas that was inserted into this framework is the idea of putting the last first. And as I said, it's very difficult to implement a program or development around these ideas. So the idea of leaving no one behind, leaving no place behind the question of spatial justice that we have right into the framework that's there, and finally leaving no ecosystem behind, because in a world in which global environmental crisis is touching us at every sort of time and place in some senses, we cannot look at the basis, we cannot not but look at the basis of life, at food or water, all the critical things that actually provide us the basis, almost at 9 billion people of living on the planet. So just to explain it very quickly, I'm going to take SDG 4, which is around education. That's on quality education at the high level. That's the goal. It's a hierarchy that has 3 levels. So each goal is broken down into a set of targets. And I can tell you some of these targets took us days and weeks to actually, formulate, because different countries, different orientations of people from science, many different other, institutions and interest groups were involved. So it's broken up into 7 targets. And I guess we'll talk about it later. So I'll fly through this very quickly. 4.1 on free primary and secondary education, 4.2 on equal access, 4.3 on equal access to affordable technical, vocational, and higher education. One of the big sort of battles as far as India is concerned. 4.4 on providing relevant skills for financial success, because access, in a sense, to finance is a very important thing. 4.5 on eliminating all forms of discrimination, which is a very real part of what India is dealing with. 4.6 on universal literacy and numeracy. 4.7, the core target that we're dealing with in this project framework, education for sustainable development and global citizenship. Something that takes us back to Tagore. In some senses, it takes us back to a whole range of other sort of leaders in education and pedagogy across the world. And then there are 3 means of implementation, A, B, and C, basically trying to upgrade schools and make them more inclusive, expanding higher education access to scholarships, and increasing the supply of qualified teachers in developing countries. So in some senses, if you look at this as somebody who works on educational systems, this is obviously not a complete frame, but this is what was possible to agree at that point of time. It has many limitations, but underlying this are a set of different indicators, and different countries actually try and draw upon them to figure out where they are. As far as India is concerned, the Niti Aayog is the agency that actually does this. They bring out a report every couple of years to track this. IHS has actually been tracking this process as far as both states and urban areas are concerned now for the last 4 years. So we're effectively leading that process both nationally and internationally in order to track what's happening. So what are the 3 or 4 critical epistemic primitives? The first thing, which is a matter of both debate and practical challenge, is the idea of universality. And we know in a very diverse environment like India or other countries that are looking at this question in this project in Africa, that universal is good, but in practice, it has a whole range of challenges when one brings it into particular context. Universality is very difficult to try and localize. How one brings that connection across multi-level systems is a fundamental challenge. The second thing is a great tension, which comes from the original definition of sustainable development, starting with the Brundtland Commission, which focused on intergenerational equity, which is something that, at least I would say, is something that was driven from the OECD, or in some senses, the more advanced economies, because that's a critical question as far as they're concerned, as far as the environment is concerned. However, in much of the global south, including the global south and the north, and you can see that in the current debates and the disturbances that we're seeing across the world, the core issue is intergenerational equity questions, whether it's gender, whether it's caste, whether it's ethnicity. That is the primary axis around which both asymmetry, exclusion, and questions of education are fundamentally involved. The Indian Constitution is framed in some senses around very critical ideas of social justice. So those are tensions inside the SDG frame, which are difficult to engage with, and I think we're going to integrate that. And within the overall framework, the big challenge, and India is one of the first countries to recognize this, I guess, globally from the 1970s onwards, is that there are three different dimensions to sustainability. Very often we think of it as only the environmental dimension because that's, you know, the later thing that came in, but dealing with both economic and social sustainability are central. And in fact, working the synergy between the three is really the most difficult, because a lot of our current development thinking, driven by both modernist and sort of neoliberal orientations, focus on the trade-off between them or the trade-off within them. And I think one of the core challenges in education is the fact that one has to try and sort of bring that together. And finally, the framework of the SDGs is tied to the question of 4 Ps: people, prosperity, planet, peace, and partnerships, which is the frame that says. So I'll just fly you through a few ideas. The first idea, of course, is the SDGs are a comparative development framework. This is a quick view of last year's report, which looks at the status of different countries. This is Sweden, that's close to the top. You can see a stoplight diagram on the right-hand side, which shows that even Sweden has challenges around some goals like climate, like responsible production and consumption. It's obviously doing very well on poverty. And we also have trends. So if you look at this frame, what you see is, as you work your way through, Sweden is number 2, the central number at the top. UK is number 13. UK has serious problems of inequality, a lot of environmental challenges. You can see the reds and the oranges coming up in between. As you proceed down, surprise, the largest economy of the world, the United States, a highly unequal country with severe economic questions, with questions of gender justice, a lot of reds there. This is kind of a set of relatively objective measures. That's China, in a sense, the savior of the development world, but its own challenges, you can see here. The sort of the polar diagram on the left shows you the range of challenges China has, because in some senses, to achieve sustainable development would be to fill out all of these questions. So they've obviously dealt with poverty. They still have issues of hunger. And of course, they have a whole questions of environmental challenges. That's South Africa, another country like India that's deeply challenged on counts, doing well on others. At a number of 107 on the ranking. And then you have India at 115. This is a global framework. We have things that drill down to a local level. I guess the question here, of course, is not only, you know, how one can actually compare that, but I guess the significant takeaway point here is with the SDGs, and in some senses, this is the deep post-colonial moment that we recognized in the General Assembly, is that all these developed countries, there is no country in the world that does not have a deficit in one dimension of sustainability or the other. And of course, that is why, in some senses, education is so critical. And I guess for India, there are many different ways, because we are a very, very diverse country. So there's, in a sense, what I would call very simply the Kerala model, which deals with questions of poverty, hunger, inequality, peace and justice. And there is the so-called Gujarat model, which much more focused at creating jobs, infrastructure, energy, smart cities, clean water, etc., a much harder view of development. So in a sense, the framework provides you a basis to be able to interrogate and build literally from block and district upwards a way to try and understand what's happening. It's not the best way of doing it, but I guess the concrete challenge that we have both epistemically and otherwise is the key to successful implementation is localization. And in a world which is actually drawing back power and centralizing this, even centralizing the process of education, this of course is pointing in the inverse direction of what we have. So how do we actually operationalize this? This is a dashboard that IH has produced the last number of years. This maps out every state, and you can see, you know, a whole range of differences across different states. A lot of reds in various places, because states that you see at the bottom end of the spectrum, Bihar, Uttar Pradesh, Chhattisgarh, Madhya Pradesh, it's all through, including in the educational dimension. We can drill this down, I would say, almost state level. The core idea, of course, which I think we may want to interrogate as I close this now, is the idea that these goals are interlinked through their targets. So when we're looking at goal 4, which is education, and of course in this focusing significantly on sustainable cities and climate change, it is a network of different processes that are connected. So you can enter from one process and continue. And of course, you know, education is tied to inequality, it's tied to gender equality, it's tied to poverty through a whole range of tangential processes, and of course, the question of employment. So I'll close here with a very simple idea, and that is COVID-19 for us is in effect the perfect SDG storm. And how would that be? We started with a huge crisis, which is ongoing in terms of health. It proceeded then to, with a maybe 10, 15, 20, maybe now 50 or 100 million people actually suffering from severe hunger. All the significant advantages that we've seen over the last many years sort of have been sort of upended. We see a serious problem in terms of our cities, 15 million people almost walking back to their homes. We see a deep crisis of unemployment and underemployment and a displacement. We see obviously schools and colleges completely being shut. We see severe problems of gender crisis. We see a big problem as far as infrastructure is concerned. We see increasing inequality both within classes and states. And of course, we see, of course, something which I think was where the SDG started with, and that is probably India receding maybe 10 years in its achievements within quotes of dealing with poverty. And finally, these implications, this would have significant implications to some of the most critical questions around the SDGs, and that is the questions of peace, justice, and institutions. So in effect, you can start with one location, and that is health, and then you'll find that if the crisis expands, it runs through the entire network. And I guess the counterfactual question that one has is, if one starts with foreign education, how quickly could we actually try and transform the way that both development and education would play itself out in the future? So COVID has exposed the key fault lines between the SDGs and within the SDGs, between countries and within countries, across class, caste, and gender. So in some senses, even though we didn't plan it, this is a wonderful opportunity for us to step out and see whether we can actually transform our ways of thinking about this process, transform the educational system, which is, I think, a very important critical multiplier and an entry point into trying to deal with that. So thank you very much. And I'm sorry I've taken a lot more time than I expected to, but I'll stop there.